The first sign that something was terribly wrong wasn't the blood on the kitchen floor. It wasn't the way her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold onto the edge of the counter. It wasn't even the terrified expression she tried so desperately to hide behind a weak smile. It was the single sentence I accidentally read 20 minutes later at urgent care, a sentence written in shaky handwriting beneath the word relationship. 2 words that completely shattered everything I thought I knew about the woman who had shared my apartment for nearly 2 years. My heart stopped, the room around me disappeared. Suddenly every strange moment, every lonely night, every sacrifice she had quietly made without asking for anything in return came crashing together into one impossible truth. I had been living beside someone whose heart had been silently carrying a love she never believed she deserved. Before we begin this emotional journey, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes that kindness has the power to change lives. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from because every story becomes even more meaningful when shared with people around the world. Life has an unusual way of placing strangers beside each other at exactly the right moment. Sometimes they become neighbors, sometimes coworkers. Sometimes they become roommates simply because rent is too expensive and neither can afford a place alone. That was exactly how Emily entered my life. I wasn't looking for friendship. After my engagement had collapsed only 6 months before, I had buried myself in work and convinced myself that keeping everyone at a distance was safer than risking disappointment again. The apartment felt painfully quiet after my ex-fiancée moved out, and every room reminded me of plans that would never happen. Financially, I couldn't manage the rent by myself anymore, so I posted an advertisement online hoping to find someone responsible enough to split the bills. Emily answered the listing. She arrived carrying only 2 worn suitcases, an old backpack, and a small cardboard box filled with books whose corners had softened from years of reading. She apologized 3 different times before even stepping through the front door, worried she might somehow inconvenience me. She spoke softly, smiled politely, and somehow managed to make herself almost invisible. She wasn't the kind of person people immediately noticed. She wasn't loud. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't constantly sharing stories about herself. She simply existed with a quiet grace that made every room feel calmer. Within weeks, I realized she was unlike anyone I'd ever lived with. She always replaced groceries before anyone noticed they were running low. She watered the plants I kept forgetting about. She folded kitchen towels. She remembered birthdays without ever asking for recognition. She left encouraging notes whenever she knew I had an important meeting. She somehow made an apartment feel like a home without ever claiming credit for it. Yet despite everything she did for everyone else, almost nobody seemed to do the same for her. Every morning she left before sunrise wearing faded blue scrubs. Every evening she returned exhausted. Whenever I asked how work had gone, she always answered the same way: busy. That single word became a wall around her emotions. Months passed, then almost a year. Gradually, I learned tiny pieces of her life. She worked as a medical assistant while taking online nursing classes during the evenings. She sent part of every paycheck to help her younger brother attend college. She hadn't spoken to her parents in years. Whenever family came up in conversation, her eyes immediately drifted somewhere else. Pain lived there, old pain. The kind that settles permanently behind someone's smile. I never pushed. Some wounds deserve patience instead of questions. Meanwhile, our friendship slowly grew through ordinary moments. Late-night takeout after impossible work days. Watching old movies neither of us admitted we enjoyed. Helping each other assemble impossible furniture. Laughing over burnt dinners. Driving to the grocery store at midnight because we both craved ice cream. Nothing dramatic, nothing romantic. Just 2 lonely people accidentally building something that looked remarkably like family. Looking back now, I wonder how I missed the signs. There were so many. Emily never dated. Whenever coworkers invited her out after work, she always declined. She rarely bought new clothes despite working endless overtime. Whenever someone complimented her appearance, she immediately changed the subject. It was almost as though she genuinely couldn't imagine anyone seeing her as worthy of affection. At the time, I assumed she was simply focused on school. I never imagined something much deeper had shaped her entire life. Everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday. Rain hammered against the apartment windows from early morning. The city looked gray enough to erase every color. I had taken the day off after finishing a major project and planned to spend it catching up on sleep. Around noon, I heard something crash in the kitchen. The sound wasn't loud enough to panic me immediately. Maybe a dropped plate, maybe a pan. Then came silence, an uncomfortable silence. I walked into the kitchen expecting to find broken dishes. Instead, I found Emily collapsed beside the counter. One hand clutched her stomach. The other reached weakly toward a chair she couldn't quite grab. A glass lay shattered nearby. Blood mixed with spilled water across the floor. Her face had turned almost completely white. For one terrifying second, I honestly believed she was dying. Everything happened automatically after that. I called her name, no answer. I knelt beside her. Her skin felt cold. She tried to reassure me with the faintest smile imaginable, even as tears gathered in her eyes. She whispered that she was probably fine. Nothing about her looked fine. Within minutes, we were driving toward urgent care through pounding rain while every red traffic light felt unbearably long. She apologized the entire drive. Apologized for ruining my day. Apologized for worrying me. Apologized for making the car dirty. Even while barely conscious, she worried more about everyone else's inconvenience than her own suffering. That realization hurt almost as much as seeing her collapse. The waiting room buzzed with quiet conversations, crying children, ringing phones, and exhausted nurses moving quickly between patients. Emily struggled to complete the intake paperwork. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Without thinking, I offered to help. She nodded thankfully. Name, birthday, insurance, emergency contact, medical history. Everything was routine until we reached one simple section, relationship status. She took the clipboard back from me. For the first time since arriving, she hesitated. She stared at the blank space for almost a full minute. Then slowly she wrote something. Before handing the clipboard to the receptionist, she set it beside me while reaching into her bag for her insurance card. I wasn't trying to invade her privacy. My eyes simply landed there. Under relationship, she hadn't written single. She hadn't written none. She hadn't written unmarried. Instead, in tiny, trembling handwriting, she had written, "In love with my roommate." He doesn't know. Time stopped. Every sound disappeared. The waiting room dissolved around me. My chest tightened so suddenly I forgot how to breathe. Surely I had misunderstood. Surely stress had made me read it wrong. I looked again. The words remained exactly the same. She quickly slid the clipboard away before realizing I'd seen it. Our eyes met. For one endless second, neither of us moved. Her expression changed instantly. Shock, embarrassment, panic, then overwhelming shame. She looked away first, not because she was angry. Because she already believed she had lost everything. I wanted to say something, anything. But before words could form, the nurse called her name. She disappeared behind the examination doors, while I remained frozen in the waiting room with those 8 words echoing endlessly inside my mind. Everything suddenly looked different. Every cup of coffee she'd quietly made for me, every birthday she'd remembered, every encouraging note, every smile, every sacrifice, every late-night conversation, had she loved me through all of it? And how had I never noticed? The next hour became the longest of my life. I replayed every memory from the past 2 years. Moments that once seemed ordinary now carried entirely different meanings. The winter evening, she'd waited 3 hours to help jumpstart my dead car. The time she stayed awake all night helping me prepare for a presentation despite working an early hospital shift. The birthday cake she baked from scratch because she knew nobody else would celebrate with me. The Christmas gift she claimed she'd found on clearance, but had obviously spent weeks saving to buy. How had I mistaken love for simple kindness? Or maybe the real question was, why had she believed she needed to hide it? When the doctor finally invited me into the examination room, Emily looked impossibly small sitting on the hospital bed. Tests suggested severe dehydration combined with exhaustion and a stress-related stomach ulcer that had worsened over months. Nothing life-threatening, but frightening enough. The doctor explained that unless she slowed down, her body would eventually force her to. She nodded politely while apologizing for causing trouble. Even the doctor gently reminded her that illness wasn't something requiring an apology. After he left, silence settled over the room. Neither of us mentioned the clipboard. Neither of us knew how. Rain continued tapping softly against the window. Machines hummed quietly nearby. She stared at the blanket covering her legs. Finally, she whispered something so softly I almost missed it. She said she was sorry, sorry for embarrassing herself, sorry if I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to, sorry if things became awkward now, still apologizing, always apologizing. As though her feelings themselves were mistakes. I looked at her and suddenly realized something heartbreaking. She wasn't afraid I didn't love her. She had already accepted that possibility long ago. What terrified her was losing the friendship that had become her entire support system. That realization hurt more than anything. I reached for the chair beside her bed and sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. Sunlight pushed gently through dark clouds. Neither of us knew it yet, but the hardest conversation of our lives was only beginning. If this story is touching your heart so far, stay with us because the most emotional chapter is still ahead. The silence inside that small examination room felt heavier than anything either of us had ever carried. Outside, the rain that had battered the windows all afternoon had faded into a gentle drizzle, and warm sunlight slowly began breaking through the clouds. It almost seemed as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily continued staring at the blanket covering her knees, twisting the edge of it between trembling fingers. Her eyes were swollen from holding back tears she desperately didn't want me to see. For nearly 2 years, she had hidden one truth behind countless acts of kindness, believing that loving someone quietly was safer than risking losing them completely. Now the secret she had guarded so carefully was sitting between us, impossible to ignore. I realized then that this moment wasn't really about romance. It was about fear, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear that the one place she finally called home would disappear because of a few handwritten words. Looking at her, I understood that she wasn't waiting for me to tell her I loved her back. She was preparing herself to pack those same 2 worn suitcases she had arrived with almost 2 years earlier. In her mind, she had already convinced herself she would have to leave. I finally broke the silence by telling her there was nothing she needed to apologize for. Kindness had never been something to be ashamed of, and neither were honest feelings. She looked at me with disbelief, almost as though those words belonged to someone else. For a long moment she simply cried, quietly wiping away tears she had hidden from the world for far too long. Little by little, the walls around her heart began to crack. She admitted that she had fallen in love almost without realizing it. It hadn't happened because of grand romantic moments. It happened because of ordinary Tuesdays, shared grocery lists, movie nights, late-night conversations, and the simple comfort of coming home, knowing someone genuinely cared whether she had eaten dinner. She confessed that after my broken engagement, she had promised herself she would never tell me how she felt. She believed I deserved someone brighter, prettier, more confident, someone who didn't come with emotional scars and family baggage. Loving me quietly seemed easier than risking becoming another painful memory in my life. Every sentence revealed just how little she thought of herself. She believed she wasn't enough. Not successful enough, not beautiful enough, not interesting enough, not worthy enough. Listening to her was heartbreaking because none of it was true. I had spent 2 years seeing a woman whose compassion quietly changed every room she entered. She remembered birthdays nobody else remembered. She cared for strangers all day at the clinic before coming home to study until midnight. She never hesitated to help anyone, even when she had almost nothing herself. Yet somehow she couldn't recognize the extraordinary person everyone else saw. When I finally spoke again, I admitted something that surprised even me. I told her I hadn't realized what my feelings were because I had spent so long protecting myself after losing my engagement. I had convinced myself friendship was enough. I had buried every possibility beneath routines and responsibilities because opening my heart again felt dangerous. Somewhere along the way, Emily had quietly become the person I wanted to tell every piece of good news to first. She had become the first person I looked for when I came home, and the one whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. Without realizing it, she had become my safe place. The tears she cried after hearing those words weren't dramatic. They were silent, almost disbelieving, as though years of loneliness were finally beginning to loosen their grip. Neither of us rushed into anything that day. There was no movie-style kiss, no dramatic music, no perfect ending inside a hospital room. Instead, I simply reached over and held her hand. For someone who had spent years believing she wasn't worth choosing, that simple gesture meant everything. The doctor discharged her later that evening with strict instructions to rest, eat properly, and reduce stress. As we drove home beneath clearing skies, neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt peaceful. The apartment looked exactly the same when we walked through the front door, yet somehow everything had changed. The following weeks weren't magical. Healing rarely is. Emily had to reduce her work hours, something she hated because it meant less money for her younger brother's tuition. Without telling her, I quietly transferred money into the account she normally used to send him support. When she discovered it, she immediately tried to repay me. I reminded her of every meal she had cooked, every ride she had given me, every difficult day she had made easier. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid because they were never debts in the first place. They were acts of love. For the first time since we'd met, she allowed someone to care for her. That turned out to be far harder than caring for everyone else. As the weeks passed, we learned things about each other we had never shared before. She told me about growing up in a home where affection was always conditional. Her parents praised perfection but criticized every mistake. Eventually, she stopped believing compliments because they always came with expectations. When she left home to build her own life, she promised herself she would become someone useful. If she couldn't be loved, maybe she could at least be needed. That sentence stayed with me for days. Maybe she could at least be needed. How many people quietly live believing usefulness is the closest they'll ever come to love? I shared my own failures too. The broken engagement, the months I blamed myself, the loneliness that lingered long after everyone assumed I had moved on. The truth was we had both been carrying invisible wounds while pretending everything was fine. One rainy Saturday afternoon, nearly 2 months after the hospital visit, I found the same clipboard form tucked inside one of Emily's nursing textbooks. She had accidentally brought it home among her paperwork. The page still contained the handwritten words that had changed everything. In love with my roommate. He doesn't know. She laughed nervously when she realized I was holding it. Instead of putting it away, I took a pen from the kitchen drawer. Beneath her sentence, I wrote one of my own. I know now. And I don't ever want you to hide your heart again. When she read it, she smiled in a way I had never seen before. Not politely, not shyly, not cautiously. She smiled freely. Months turned into a year. Emily graduated from nursing school with honors. Watching her walk across the stage, I couldn't stop thinking about the frightened woman who believed she wasn't enough. She had no idea that the loudest applause in the auditorium came from someone whose life she had quietly transformed long before receiving that diploma. After the ceremony, we visited the small park where we had first eaten takeout together as roommates. We sat on the same old bench, sharing fries exactly as we had done countless times before. This time, however, the future looked completely different. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Immediately, she shook her head, overwhelmed before I had even opened it. Not because she didn't want the future, because she still couldn't believe she deserved it. I gently reminded her of something she had once told me during one of our late-night conversations. She had said that home wasn't a place. Home was the person who made the world feel less frightening. I told her she had become my home long before either of us admitted what our hearts already knew. With tears streaming down both our faces, I asked her to spend the rest of our lives building a home together. She didn't answer right away. She simply cried, laughed, covered her face, and nodded over and over again before finally managing to whisper yes. Sometimes the happiest moments aren't loud. Sometimes they're simply two people realizing they never have to face life alone again. Their wedding took place the following spring beneath enormous oak trees in a small public garden. There were no expensive decorations, no celebrity guests, and no extravagant reception. Friends from the clinic, neighbors, former classmates, and even patients whose lives Emily had touched filled the chairs. One elderly woman hugged her for nearly 5 minutes because Emily had once stayed past the end of her shift. just to keep her company while she waited for difficult test results. That was who Emily had always been, someone who quietly healed hearts without expecting anyone to notice. Standing there watching her walk toward me, I realized something profound. Love isn't always discovered in fireworks. Sometimes it's found in grocery receipts, shared rent, coffee left on the counter, medicine picked up after work. The person who remembers how you take your tea, the one who notices when you're pretending to be okay, the one who chooses you every ordinary day. 5 years later, our little house became much louder. 2 children filled every room with laughter. Emily still left encouraging notes in lunch boxes. She still overworked herself caring for patients. She still apologized too much, although far less than before. Whenever our daughter made mistakes, Emily always knelt beside her and reminded her that love was never something that had to be earned. She was giving our children the childhood she never received. One evening, our son asked how Mommy and Daddy first fell in love. Emily laughed nervously. I walked into my office and returned holding a carefully framed piece of paper. Inside the frame was the copied urgent care intake form. Our children read the handwritten sentence aloud before looking at us with confused expressions. Then they noticed my sentence written underneath. Our daughter smiled. "So Mommy loved you first?" I smiled back. "No, she taught me what love looked like first." If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that genuine kindness never goes unnoticed. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need hope today. Speech balloon before we reach the end. Leave a comment below with just one word. Home, if you believe the right person can completely change someone's life without even realizing it. We'd love to read your thoughts. Years after that unforgettable day at urgent care, I often found myself thinking about how close I had come to missing the greatest blessing of my life. If Emily hadn't become sick, if I hadn't happened to glance at that clipboard, if fear had continued keeping both of us silent, we might have spent years living under the same roof, while never truly knowing each other's hearts. Life rarely gives us dramatic signs. More often, it gives us ordinary moments and asks whether we're paying attention. The greatest love stories aren't always built on perfect timing or grand romantic gestures. They're built on small acts of compassion repeated every single day, until two hearts slowly realize they've been choosing each other all along. Sometimes the person you're searching for isn't waiting somewhere far away. Sometimes they're already sitting across the dinner table, quietly making sure your coffee stays warm, believing they'll never be more than your roommate. And sometimes all it takes to change two lives forever is one honest sentence written beneath the word relationship. The end.